increasing. The natural gas is going to remain 26%, roughly a quarter of our energy portfolio. Where's that gas going to come from? This is the supply side of that equation. You'll see the trend is the natural gas supplies in the United States are diminishing. In Michigan, our peak gas was in 1996. The world has passed peak gas, so these conventional sources are decreasing. Shale gas is the only thing poised to provide the natural gas that I explained is coming from that portfolio 25 years out. And you'll notice about in 2005, there's a rapid increase in shale gas exploration. This has been principally going on in Pennsylvania, Texas, and other states out west. Michigan, around 2010, again, that same time, we've seen probably anywhere, I'm going to say about 14 wells in Michigan where we've had companies exploring these shale and tight gas reservoirs with long horizontal drilling and high volume hydraulic fracturing. Just to give you an idea where this is occurring, the high volume, I'll take it just a minute to define high volume hydraulic fracturing. The DEQ considers anything that's over 100,000 gallons of fluid used in the hydraulic fracturing process to be high volume. These dots here denote the majority of the activities going on up in the Kalkaska area, Misaki, some in Antrim, Sheboygan, and we also have one down in Hillsdale County, which was a couple wells hydraulically fractured in the Van Wert zone. I want to talk a little bit about well construction and hydraulic fracturing. First, I want to talk a little bit about layers. Michigan Basin geology. Michigan is a sedimentary basin where the rock units were laid down in ancient seas of varying depths over time. And the point that I want to make here is that we have crystalline rocks that form a bowl, and we have sedimentary rocks or layers that go up. Some of these layers have a lot of porosity or pore space in it, like sandstone. Some of them have nearly zero porosity, so they don't hold anything. The wells that don't have any porosity, or the formations or layers that don't have porosity, are typically caps. Fluids don't move up through them. Gas and oil tends to move up, and it tends to move towards low pressure. So if these caps were not in place, any layers that contain hydrocarbons, these would automatically be moving up over time and being released. The thing that I want to point out here in Michigan, you'll see the glacial deposits along the top. Glacial deposits is where the groundwater resources are, the fresh water, and then also in some of the upper bedrock surfaces such as the Marshall Sandstone areas. This is occurring anywhere from 0 to 300 feet below ground. The oil and gas development that we're talking about today with hydraulic fracturing in the well that's being proposed in Ravenna is occurring 4,500 feet underground. The wells that I showed you up in northern Michigan are occurring anywhere from 7,500 to 9,000 feet below ground. If there's one thing that I want you to take away from tonight, it's the number one concern of the DEQ, which is the migration and mixing of fluids between formations or between layers under the earth. There's hydrocarbons in some of these layers down deep. We have no interest in seeing hydrocarbons mixed between layers. And we don't have any interest in seeing drilling fluids or hydraulic fracturing fluids mixed between layers. So I'm going to give you the anatomy of an oil and gas well. And whether the well is going to be hydraulically fractured or whether it's a conventional oil and gas well, the construction is largely the same. It always starts with a conductor pipe placed usually down to about 60 feet in the ground to give the hole a straight start. Then we drill out, companies drill out to start the surface casing. The surface casing is installed to 100 feet below the lowest freshwater aquifers so that the freshwater resources are sealed off. It also has to go 100 feet into competent bedrock, so you have a good seal. Then it's cemented back to surface. The cement has to sit for a minimum of 12 hours to get proper strength and bond to both the formation and the wall of the pipe. From there, we get ready to drill an intermediate casing. The intermediate casing is very important. I want you to remember that because we're often asked, why are we different than places like Pennsylvania? If some of you have watched the movie Gasland and you've heard about DNR, Pennsylvania, they've made the accusation that hydraulic fracturing caused water well contamination there. And there was about 19 wells that were impacted in that instance, but it was a well construction issue. When the Marcellus plague hit Pennsylvania, they had about 4,000 wells installed really before they were geared up, and they had very little in the way of well construction requirements, which the state has had in place since 1973. We had our version of that sort of well construction incident back in 1972 in Williamsburg. And in that case, we had natural gas coming up in Grand Traverse Bay, Torch Lake, people's houses, and it was larger than what you would say was in DNR, Pennsylvania. In that case, when you drill ahead with an oil and gas well, you're using weighted mud, and you're counting on the weight of that weighted mud to hold down any pressures that you hit with gas coming back up at you. Well, when you do that, if you pop into a high pressure gas zone, you can become underbalanced, and that gas will move up this bore. And any zones that you have that are open, like sandstones or fractured limestones, that gas can come up and will seep those. And in that case in Williamsburg, it got into the layer called the Traverse limestone, which subcrops and comes out into Grand Traverse Bay, and you had methane escaping into Grand Traverse Bay. In 1973, we issued a requirement for an intermediate casing. Again, why this is very important is because it's given us 40 years of safety in the state of Michigan and many wells drilled. The intermediate casing is set down through these open zones and stopped prior to where we anticipate the high pressure gas zones that are at depth. It's again a secondary line of defense so that you don't have these zones open when you get down into deeper zones that have higher pressures of gas. That casing is set and cemented back to surface. So now you have surface casing sealing off the groundwater, and you have the intermediate casing sealing off intermediate zones at depth. From there, an oil and gas company will go ahead and drill out beyond the intermediate casing down to a target formation such as this. Typically they'll go vertically. If their plan is to complete this well vertically, they'll perforate in this area and complete the well in the target formation. What we're seeing in the carbonates and shales up north, they're long horizontals, so they'll plug back, they'll pick this well off, build a curve, and do a long horizontal. Technology since 1985 has improved so much with geosteering. This formation could be anywhere from 15 to 30 feet thick. In the case of the Collingwood, they can run this horizontal for 2 miles and stay inside that 30-foot thick formation. At that point, whether they hydraulically fracture this in multiple stages, and in the antrim wells and shallow wells, this frac job might only be 3 to 5 stages of hydraulic fracture. In a long horizontal that's 2 miles long, you may have 20 to 40 hydraulic fracturing stages, where they start at the toe and do it in stages coming back to the heel. When I say perforate and hydraulic frac, what we're talking about is they put a tool down here that has a controlled explosion that perforates the steel, the concrete, or the cement, and about 4 feet into the formation. At that point, they're ready to do hydraulic fracturing. The process of hydraulic fracturing, again, done in many stages, is simply, at that point, they They inject high-pressure fluids containing proppant, which is sand, either resin or natural beach sand or ceramic sand. Down here under pressure, they raise the pressure to the point where rock cracks. They propagate these cracks through the target formation. They go out longer horizontally than they do vertically, and then they take the pressure off that. The purpose of the proppant is when they take the pressure off it, the sand grains stay inside of the cracks. So you had a shale or a limestone that had hydrocarbons locked up inside the pore space of that rock unit, but did not have a way to flow naturally to a borehole like conventional sandstones do. Now they have artificial stimulation, artificial cracks that are propped open, and the gas begins to flow to the borehole and up for sale. The use of chemical additives for friction reducers, viscosifiers, are meant to carry the sand down into the formation and then also break that viscosity to allow the sand to stay and the fluid to come back. Recognizing that high volume hydraulic fracturing was different than the shallow hydraulic fracturing, we had met with third-party stakeholders, been reviewing this. We had issued in May 2011 Supervisor's Instruction 1-2011. It set forth new requirements for these high-volume hydraulic fracture projects that required approval of a water withdrawal, water level monitoring, reporting of fracture pressures, volumes, and submittal of material safety data sheets, so we knew what was being used on these sites. The main focus of the DEQ can really be summarized in these. The migration of gas or fracture fluids. Again, the number one thing that I wanted, and I put number one there for a reason. The number one thing I wanted this group to take away today is that the DEQ is principally concerned about migration of these fluids. They're meant to be kept where they're at. We're also concerned with water use. These are all important, but if I had to rate them, and I'm sure water use is number one on your mind, I would put it more at number two for us. But we're also concerned about management of flowback water, handling of any surface spills and surface materials, the identification of chemical additives, air quality, and also earthquakes and microseismic activity. Those of you that may have seen Gasland have seen the flaming faucets. Flaming faucets occurred in Pennsylvania before hydraulic fracturing came to town. Flaming faucets occurred in Michigan. This is a Michigan document in 1965. There's biogenic gas and stray gas issues that are in nearly every state. Pennsylvania has a history of about 300,000 wells being drilled there. They have about 8,000 wells on their orphan well list, and they didn't have good well construction requirements until recently. In Michigan, this is the Antrim Shale, and below that glacial drift that I showed you, because the rock units are upturned, where they upturn and meet the glacial drift, we call that subcropping. Well, where the units that contain oil and gas are, you get some natural release of gas that's coming up out of those subcrops into the glacial drift that can get into gas. So these black dots represent records that we have of gas. Not all of these are related to subcrop issues. Some of them are biogenic gas. In the glacial deposits, we have many swamps that are buried. And anywhere you get that biologic activity, you're going to get the creation of biogenic gas. It has the potential of coming up and getting into wells. Water use. I said there was about 12,000 wells hydraulically fractured with the Antrim. Those are vertical, shallow. Usually they were 3 to 4 stages, using more like 50,000 gallons of water. A long horizontal that we've been seeing over the last couple of years is using anywhere from 2 to 30 million gallons. We haven't had one done with 30 million gallons yet, but we've got the applications for them. The well that some of you may be familiar with in Urbana is proposing 2.1 million gallons. That's in a limestone and not a shale where these larger volumes are being used. The DEQ requires the water assessment tool. The water assessment tool is a screening tool. It indicates whether there's going to be an adverse impact. If there's an adverse impact, the DEQ will not issue that authorization to withdraw. DEQ requires groundwater monitoring if there's any residential wells within 1,320 feet of the proposed withdrawal. The groundwater tool is principally concerned with the base flow of our streams. So the impact of the withdrawal on the aquifer and not impacting the base flow of the streams such that it will impact aquatic resources. The idea behind the 1,320 is that when there's a residential well involved within 1,320 feet, that we would install a monitoring well so that we could monitor any drawdown or impact that would be heading towards these wells. This is just a fun fact, food for thought. The USGS 2000 data shows about 267 billion gallons of water withdrawn from groundwater in Michigan a year. Berrien County using about 10 million gallons per day for agriculture, with up to 90% lost on a windy, sunny day due to evapotranspiration. And additional considerations, the North Branch of the Manistee River annual recharge rate is 8.8 billion gallons per year. Part of the concern that's been expressed is that with hydraulic fracturing, the fluid that comes back up, you inject this water into the formation to hydraulically fracture it. The water that's been withdrawn from freshwater aquifers is lost to the hydrologic cycle. It's true that water is being either kept in the formation, or anywhere from 10 to 30% of the water comes back as flowback fluid and is re-injected into deep disposal zones and is not available to the hydrologic cycle in that watershed at that place. When you combust methane, however, you do create water. Every 90 cubic feet of natural gas that's burned creates a gallon of water. In the case of a well up north, in the first 9 months of production, if you combusted the gas that came out of that well, it did in fact create about 6 million gallons of water for the hydrologic cycle. Now, does it come back down in the same spot, in the same watershed in the North Branch of the Manistee? It does not. But it does not come back down if it's a water bottling plant, if it's evapotranspiration off our lakes, our fields, our golf courses. It does not all go back to the same location. We're concerned with flowback water, the management of flowback water. In some states, you may ask what makes us different from some states. In Michigan, flowback fluid is not allowed to be disposed of in pits. It has to be contained in steel frac tanks and be disposed of down type 2 disposal well. Concerned with spill prevention. Back to the secondary containment. This is a chemical truck at a hydraulic fracturing operation. This is how chemicals come in. They're pre-mixed, they're in poly containers. They go from the containers into what's called a blend truck through low pressure lines, and they're required to be on secondary containment, heavy mill plastic liners. I'm going to touch on microseismic and earthquakes for a moment. There's studies around the United States that show that injection of fluids deep into basement rock under high pressures can trigger seismic activity. Primarily, these are low magnitude events under 3.0 that are not usually felt by humans. There's been some earthquakes that have been attributed to injection that are more up around the 5 range, and those will shake a house. So what makes us different about Michigan? Well, in Michigan, we don't inject down into the deep basement rock, and we don't inject it under high pressure. If I took you back to that slide of the layers of Michigan geology, We have several layers deep in the earth that are not down near the basement rock that actively take water. They're already wet with brine or salty water. So these wells, they're constructed much the same way that I showed you an oil and gas well is to prevent the mixing of fluids. When you put the water, the disposal water down these wells, it flows down these wells under lower pressure and into these formations, and the DEQ and the EPA track volumes and pressures that those are being injected. So I would say microseismic, there's some models out there, best management practices, 5 and 10-step processes to deal with microseismic. In Michigan, I don't ever see us getting past 1 or 2, the first couple steps of those. And why I say that is we've got 700 disposal wells that have been actively discharging wastewater into these zones under low pressure for decades, and we haven't seen it. Michigan is not a seismically active basin, and the water's been flowing into these formations without seismic incident. If they had, if we were seeing some of that, then you're going to advance your reaction to that, and there's some strategies for dealing with that. We know of one area that we're watching. If we ever see a disposal well proposed in those areas and down deep, we would look at that very critically and perhaps implement some of these further steps that could be used. The primary further steps that we don't ever get to is while they're doing the disposal or while they're doing hydraulic fracturing, if microseismic is indicated, you shut it down, you stop, okay? And you don't go any further and you reevaluate. Again, I don't see that happening in Michigan because we have decades of disposal going on with no microseismic activity. Methane emissions. DEQ is involved with air quality. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas, I think 16 times more potent than other greenhouse gases. Oil and gas leads that with 145 million metric tons per year. Enteric fermentation is 137 and landfills behind it. Enteric fermentation, this is where I was trying to add some levity, is cow farts. This is the animals passing methane that gets the number 2 spot. These top 3 offenders with greenhouse gases are 9% of the total makeup of greenhouse gases that are generated. This is globally. So the DEQ is interested in not directly releasing methane. The way that you don't directly release methane is you destroy it. You destroy it by combustion with flares that are 95% efficient. So sometimes when you have a new gas well, during a testing period or a flowback period where you don't have a sales line, you find yourself in a position where you've got that release of methane and you're going to destroy it. Now the wells up north, their main business model is get that in a sales line because they want to sell it, they don't want to destroy it. But it does happen sometimes with conventional oil and gas. If you have an oil well, you don't have a gas sales line, you get associated gas back to that oil and it has to be destructed rather than released, and we do that with a flare. The DEQ requires capturing of gas and flaring. I think we're ahead of the EPA on that. The EPA just passed in 2012 new provisions for green completions of oil and gas sites, and that was basically the EPA is requiring capture and combustion, which DEQ is already there. They're taking it a step forward, and they're going to have, by 2015, our combustion chambers, completion combustion chamber device, sort of going to certify that you have a proper combustion. So it's going to be involved a little bit with flow rates and that sort of thing. This group is working with our group on memorandums of understanding because the Office of Oil, Gas, and Minerals is involved with Air Quality Division and EPA on implementing those rules. I'll finish up with mentioning that DEQ feels that the measures that we implemented in 1-2011 provides a strong regulatory framework for addressing hydraulic fracturing, high-volume hydraulic fracturing. We are looking forward to a couple big studies that are coming out. The EPA has a large study being conducted right now that is involved with all levels of state and federal governments, private institutions. There's starting to be some data coming back out of these studies just this week. I think if you're following the media, the EPA's had a couple releases where they're backing off some initial statements. They're finding out more about this. The University of Michigan is sort of probably about 6 months into their comprehensive study. It's involving like 26 different areas of research. They're delving more into socioeconomic impacts,